Hello and welcome to Occult Book Review. This week's book is The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. I suppose in some ways this book is a bit different to previous books we've looked at in that there's no overall thesis that the author is trying to prove. Instead, it's more of a compendium of occult knowledge, and it's a hell of a compendium. If I was to sit here and just list off the topics that Hall covers, this video would go on for hours. But suffice to say, it's an essential book that every occult historian, or I would say any person interested in spiritual wisdom, should have on their bookshelf. Before we even get into some of the subjects that Hall covers, it's worth thinking about why this book has been so successful. And I was just thinking about this yesterday when I was coming up with what I was going to talk about here. At the time when the book first came out, which was 1928, it was a really fertile time for new spiritual ideologies. We were coming out of a period of Theosophy, the Golden Dawn, the spiritualist movements, even the suffrage movement to some extent, where women were having a much more visible presence when it came to being spiritual leaders in their own right. Blavatsky, I suppose, is the obvious example there. So there really was a fertile environment, as I've said, for new ideas. But not only that, a lot of the new spiritual groups and churches and philosophies wanted to believe and wanted to show that they had their roots in ancient philosophies and teachings. They all wanted to be perceived as being right as well, of course. But when Hall brought this book out, he had collected so many different traditions from all around the world that it was quite easy for new groups to associate themselves with philosophies, teachings that had been lost to the mainstream, certainly, and it offered converts, I suppose, potential converts, a whole tradition that they could look back on themselves and validate where they were going and what they were believing. It's worth acknowledging that at the time when this book was put together, even mainstream scholars believed in a flood, mostly a biblical flood, but the idea of an ancient culture having kind of been destroyed and wisdom surviving through secret societies wasn't so far-fetched. So certainly it wasn't as frowned upon. And then over the kind of 20th century, academia, with, I suppose you could say, good intentions, wanted to move away from the whole idea of biblical history being real history. And so they threw the baby out with the bathwater in a lot of ways. Hall talks about Atlantis and antediluvian societies in this book. It's kind of a foundation of the book, you might argue. And today, of course, mainstream scholars don't accept that at all. But I have to say, we're finding now with a lot of, as we delve into world mythologies, we're seeing that the flood stories actually are most likely telling us about real events that occurred. But if you can see what I mean about it being necessary to kind of push back against the biblical scholars, which were kind of, I suppose, up against Darwin as well in some ways, and they were trying to impose one particular view upon history. So for Hall, the antediluvian society is the bedrock for where his wisdom, his secret wisdom, came from. And he thinks that there was always a secret society, a secret council guiding mankind through the good times and the bad times, acting as a kind of barrier, if you like, to push back against the dark ages, I suppose. And Hall talks about how this wisdom has been preserved in symbols and in different traditions, and that's where it becomes impossible to really talk about the book in one particular context because there's so much in it. He talks about the history, his own ideas of what the history of tarot is, especially the major arcana. The major arcana being initiatory symbols dating back to ancient Egypt. Today, of course, like the chances of the Egyptians having tarot cards, for example, is pretty much non-existent. I think it's safe to say, although some people might argue about that. But the idea that they had the major arcana symbols, I think, it still stands up, especially when we talk about the Benbine tablet of Isis, for example, which Hall dedicates a chapter to in this book. He talks about how some of the symbology has been matched to tarot symbols. He doesn't agree with all of it, but it's a very interesting chapter. I've written an article about that actually, and I'll put a link to it in the YouTube video in the comments section if anyone wants to follow up on that. He also talks about Kabbalah, the roots of Kabbalah, Gnosticism, paganism, the Druids, the history of sun worship. I could actually just keep going on, but I'll just mention a few things that I think people will find interesting. He talks about the idea that the pagan saviors came first, and this idea is kind of, I suppose it's been made famous by people like Freakin' Gandhi, Acharya S, Earl Doherty. The whole Jesus mythist movement, I suppose, focuses upon earlier pagan deities with the same attributes. But you can really see that the person Hall is delving into most, I suppose, is Pythagoras, and there are quite a few chapters on Pythagoras in the book. And this becomes more important when you look at Hall's later life, because in his later life he talks about how people should stop being spectators and start being competitors, as in life itself, you know thyself. And he almost, in his later life, he almost says that there's no point in chasing after all of the hidden occult knowledge. What you need to do is improve yourself, better yourself. What good is occult knowledge to you if you're not going to be a better person, a kinder person? And so later on there are quite a few lectures where Hall talks about people should spend less time in front of TV, less time following sports, drinking alcohol, and instead improve their own lives. And in that sense, he says that too much occult knowledge can almost be a distraction. So this occult book review is a bit different. I would recommend everyone have a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages if they're interested in occult philosophy, spirituality, even history, I suppose. You can't even begin to talk about what's in the book. Everything from numerology, tarot, Kabbalah, alchemy, pagan origins of Christianity, Rosicrucianism, tarot symbols, Pythagoras, ceremonial magic. I mean, you could go on and on and on. Human body in symbols, the zodiac, astrology, Isis. Okay, so it's a book that there's no conclusion to this particular review. It's not really even a review. It's just bringing people's attention to a book that I think is certainly essential when it comes to occult knowledge. So I'll see you all again next week, hopefully, and thanks for watching.